Marvin gets on the air episode 4, Marvin's Do-It-Yourself J-Pole Antenna. An audible story about real people and real events. By Brad Tuttle. Assisted by ChatGPT and ElevenLabs AI.
With his first GMRS radio, working one-on-one with Earl, the promise of getting on the air and talking over repeaters hypnotized Marvin. The collection of copper pipe, fittings, connectors, and assorted hardware that had accumulated begged Marvin to get started. Watching YouTube videos together with Earl had convinced him that a home-built J-Pole antenna could perform every bit as well as a commercial model if they were willing to invest enough patience in tuning it. Tuning an antenna meant getting all the pieces just the right length to match the frequency one wants to use. Sure, DIY videos and diagrams helped, but in the end, antennas needed to be connected to an analyzer called a SWR meter, and through a process that somewhat resembled trial and error, the antenna is tuned. Neither Marvin nor Earl realized just how much patience that would require. YouTube videos often omit such details. The antenna was assembled with one important difference from most construction articles Marvin had studied. He deliberately avoided soldering the long and short elements together permanently. Instead, slip couplings were installed on both sections, so their lengths could be adjusted repeatedly during tuning. Furthermore, the coax feed point was attached with hose clamps rather than solder, so it too could slide up and down the matching sections. Nothing would become permanent until they were absolutely certain they had found the right combination of lengths. Marvin prepared for the tuning process with the thoroughness of someone who had already survived 92 years of life. Knowing they would be experimenting with antenna length, he carefully cut an assortment of copper pipe extensions in half-inch increments, beginning with a modest 1/2-inch piece and continuing all the way to 6 inches. Every possible extension lay neatly arranged on a table, each one carefully measured and labeled. If the antenna needed to be longer, there would be no stopping to cut another piece. They could simply loosen a slip coupling and insert the next longest extension. Their work quickly settled into a seemingly infinite routine. Marvin stationed Earl near the antenna at the far end of the 50-foot length of coax. Here, Earl could make repeated adjustments exactly as Marvin requested, without Marvin having to walk back and forth between the antenna and the radio. Walking 50 feet back and forth is tough on a person once they reach 90. Marvin stayed comfortably planted in his favorite armchair beside the radio, where the SWR meter, notebook, pencil, and reading glasses were within easy reach. After every adjustment, Earl would step back while Marvin keyed the transmitter, watched the SWR meter, and called out another reading. The notebook began neatly enough. The first page contained carefully ruled columns with headings for the lengths of the long element, the short matching section, the feed point position, the number of turns in the coax choke, and the corresponding SWR. By the second day, those orderly pages had surrendered to reality. Margins filled with corrections, arrows pointed from one measurement to another. Entire pages were crossed out only to be revived with fresh notes squeezed between the lines. Readings were circled, questioned, underlined, and occasionally followed by remarks such as much worse, don't know why, or simply, huh. Before long, the notebook looked less like an engineering journal and more like a semester of high school science lab notes. Marvin called it his Dr. Frankenstein book, or How to Build a Monster. That is an antenna. The two men developed a rhythm that would have amused anyone watching from a distance. Earl loosened a clamp, slid in another extension, or moved a piece of copper pipe barely 1/2 of an inch, tightened everything again, and announced that he was ready. 50 feet away, Marvin would key the microphone on channel 2 for only a moment, study the meter, record another reading, and suggest another tiny adjustment. Back and forth, the process continued hour after hour. Neither of them was in any particular hurry. Retirement and health had granted them something younger men seldom possessed in abundance: time. They simply worked until they grew tired, then continued the next day exactly where the notebook said they had left off. Working methodically, they tried every extension Marvin had prepared. The long element received additions, beginning with 1/2 inch and increasing in 1/2 inch steps, all the way to 6 inches. Once they had explored the possibilities for the long element, They repeated the process with the shorter matching section, working from 1/2 inch through 5 1/2 inches. That, however, was only the beginning. Whenever a particular combination showed promise, that is SWR, around 1.5 or less, Marvin insisted they investigate every possible pairing. 6 inches added to the long element with 2 inches on the short, then 6 inches with 3 inches, then 6 inches with 5 1/2 inches, 5 1/2 inches paired with 4 inches paired with 1 1/2. Every combination that seemed even remotely promising found itself highlighted and circled in the notebook. Only after exhausting every practical combination of element lengths did Marvin and Earl begin adjusting the hose clamps that held the coax feed into the radio. The feed point was moved upward a fraction of an inch, measured, then downward again. Another reading, another note, another tiny adjustment. The number of possible combinations was staggering. 12 different lengths of pipe to insert into the slip coupling on the long element, times 12 different lengths to insert for the short element, times about 10 adjustments, 5 up and 5 down, for the feed point. There were a limited number of SWR reading that some would consider good enough, but Marvin had no interest in good enough. Somewhere within that maze of copper pipe lengths and feed point positions was the antenna's sweet spot. He was determined to find it. Just when Marvin thought they had explored every possible combination and not really too happy with the results, Earl reminded Marvin that they were supposed to add a choke by winding the coax into neat loops immediately below the antenna. Once again, the measurements changed. 3 loops, 4 loops, 5 loops, and 6 loops produced different SWR readings. Marvin found it remarkable that simply winding the coax differently several feet below the antenna could noticeably change the SWR. It was another reminder that radio waves occupied an invisible world that simply refused to behave like ordinary plumbing or carpentry. Soon, the apartment itself also became another variable in the experiment. They first tested the antenna in one corner of the living room, then moved away from the walls, then positioned beside the sliding glass door. Every relocation altered the readings, carrying it outside onto the small patio and then past the sidewalk onto the parking lot, changed the readings once again. Furniture, walls, appliances, and even the glass door seemed determined to sabotage the tuning process. By the middle of the week, Marvin and Earl finally achieved nearly perfect SWR. Convinced they had succeeded, Marvin carefully soldered all the copper joints. The antenna now possessed the solid appearance of a permanent installation. It was beautiful. Proudly, they connected the SWR meter one final time. Somehow, however, soldering the antenna changed the SWR readings, and not for the better. After several minutes of puzzled examination, Earl noticed the obvious. Throughout the entire tuning process, they forgot to include the copper end caps on the top of the pipes to keep out the rain. Once soldered in place, however, the caps changed the electrical length of both elements, just enough to move the resonance. There was nothing to do but begin anew. This time, every measurement was made with the antenna exactly as it would eventually be installed, caps included. Several more evenings disappeared into careful adjustments. By now, the notebook had become a maze of numbers, arrows, corrections, and references spanning multiple pages. Only Marvin could make sense of it, sort of. Eventually, the SWR curve settled exactly where they had hoped. Repeated measurements confirmed the results. The readings remained consistent no matter how many times they checked. Their homemade J-Pole was finally finished. The only remaining challenge was how to get the J-Pole as high as possible. Marvin lived on the ground floor. After some friendly persuasion, the resident of the third-floor apartment directly above Marvin agreed to let them mount the antenna on their balcony railing. The coax feed wire was routed carefully down the outside of the building to Marvin's apartment below, where it entered through the sliding glass door. The additional elevation transformed the antenna's performance. Repeaters that had previously been weak to non-existent came alive. Oakley, O'Queer, Ogden, Draper. Stations that had once seemed well beyond the reach of a modest apartment station now responded with strong, dependable signals. The antenna exceeded every expectation. Cowabunga! But elevation was not their greatest obstacle. This turned out to be apartment management. Immediately, Cheryl, the apartment manager, noticed the bright copper structure attached to the third-floor balcony, along with the black coax cable running into, guess whose apartment? Marvin's. She forthwith informed Marvin in no uncertain terms that the apartment complex would not tolerate ugly radio antennas. Marvin had wrestled with Cheryl before, and this time he wasn't about to remove his antenna. No, that is not how Marvin operates. Instead, another trip to Ace Hardware produced an array of paint that perfectly matched the colors of the apartment building. The antenna received several careful coats, including shading and highlights where needed. The exposed coax was painted as well, blending neatly against the exterior of the Shady Rest apartments, until both virtually disappeared against the building. A few days later, Cheryl walked past the building and glared upward. Squinting but still seeing no antenna, she smiled with satisfaction and continued on her way. Winning any spat with Marvin felt good to Cheryl. Very good indeed. Over the following weeks, Marvin spent evening after evening enjoying conversations through repeaters that had once seemed hopelessly out of reach. More importantly, he had learned something that no catalog could have taught him. A good antenna was not merely purchased, it was created. Every adjustment, every measurement, every unexpected setback had contributed to a deep feeling of understanding and belonging. The antenna had become an extension of Marvin in a very real sense. The thick notebook of measurements occupied a special place on a shelf beside his radio. It contained far more than dimensions and SWR readings. It documented the week Marvin stopped simply owning radio equipment and began transmitting what felt like a portion of himself across the waves. For the first time since receiving his GMRS license, Marvin no longer felt like someone who merely owned a radio. He was now a radio operator. Watching the little homemade J-Pole outperform antennas that cost many times as much convinced Earl that he needed one of his own. Fortunately, Marvin already possessed a notebook full of notes that would save them both several days of work. At least that was the plan.